Welcome to Revenge Stories with Father, where real stories of betrayal, justice, and second chances are told with honesty and heart. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. My daughter-in-law changed the locks on my house while I was away. My son stood beside her and said, "Dad, it's really for the best." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I drove to a hotel, checked in, and made one phone call. 3 months later, they were packing boxes in the rain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should explain how we got there. My name is Harold. I'm 63 years old. I spent 41 years building a construction and property management company in Columbus, Ohio, starting with a second-hand pickup truck and a commercial contractor's license I earned. The summer I turned 22. My wife, Loretta, was beside me through every lean year, every missed mortgage payment, every project that came in under budget and over deadline. She used to joke that she married a man who smelled like drywall and ambition. She said it like a compliment. Loretta passed away 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I still reach for the phone sometimes to call her when something good happens. Our son, Ethan, was 34 at the time of all this. Handsome kid, always the smartest person in any room he thought he was in. He works in corporate finance at a firm downtown, or he did. His wife, Gwen, was 32, an interior designer with a client list she was very proud of and a talent for making other people feel like they were one renovation away from finally having a life worth living. They got married 6 years ago. I paid for the wedding, not because they asked me to, well, they did ask me to, but because Loretta had always imagined being there for it, and paying for it was the closest thing I had to including her. $62,000 at a venue outside Cincinnati. Open bar, a band, a cake that looked like architecture. Gwen's parents flew in from Phoenix and shook my hand and said I had raised a fine young man. I believed them. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because I have thought about this a great deal in the time since. I was not a perfect father. I was present, I was loving, but I made Ethan's life very easy in ways that were not always good for him. When he struggled in college, I paid for a tutor and then quietly had a conversation with a dean I knew from a development board. When he wanted to move into a downtown apartment on a junior analyst salary, I told him I'd cover the difference between what he could afford and what he wanted. When Gwen's design business had a slow year, I introduced her to 3 of my property clients and suggested they use her for staging work. I handed things to my son the way you hand a glass of water to someone who's thirsty, without ever teaching him to find the well himself. I see that now. What I did not see, until it was sitting directly in front of me, was what that had turned him into. Last October, I drove down to spend a long weekend in Columbus. I'd been doing some consulting work up in Cleveland and hadn't seen Ethan and Gwen in about 6 weeks. When I arrived at their apartment building, a high-rise in the Short North neighborhood that I happened to know the building's ownership group fairly well, though Ethan believed he had gotten the apartment through connections of his own, Gwen met me at the door. She did not hug me. She stepped aside and gestured me in like I was a contractor coming to review the job site. Ethan was at the kitchen island looking at his phone. He stood and shook my hand. Like we were closing a deal. We had dinner. Gwen had ordered something from a restaurant nearby, which she plated to look like she'd cooked it, a habit I had noticed before, but never mentioned. The conversation was polished and distant. They asked about my health. I asked about their work. At some point during what I understood to be the appetizer course, Gwen set down her fork, folded her hands, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as professionally sympathetic. "Harold," she said, "Ethan and I have been doing a lot of thinking about your situation." I waited. "You've been rattling around in that house in Bexley for 4 years by yourself. It's a big house, high maintenance, and the neighborhood is changing. The property values have actually peaked, which means this is probably the best time to sell." I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. "The house in Bexley," I said, "is where I raised your husband." "Of course," Gwen said. "And it holds a lot of memories. That's exactly why it might be healthier for you to start fresh somewhere. There are some beautiful 55-plus communities outside Dublin. Nice amenities, people your own age, no yard to worry about. I asked if I had somehow given the impression that I was struggling with my yard. Ethan finally looked up. Dad, Gwen has a point. It's a 4-bedroom house. You're one person. And honestly, the capital tied up in that property could give you a really comfortable retirement. We could help you look at options. The capital tied up in that property. My son said that, about the house where he learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where Loretta planted rose bushes along the back fence that still bloomed every June, where we had lived every important moment of our family's life. He called it capital. I said I appreciated their concern and that I would think about it. Gwen smiled in a way that suggested she considered the matter settled. I drove to my hotel that night instead of staying in their guest room. I told them I didn't want to be a burden. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention. I started tracking things I had previously let blur past me. The apartment they lived in, I made a few quiet calls and confirmed what I already suspected. The building management company had a long-standing arrangement with my development firm. The unit had been made available as a professional courtesy extended through my network at a rate significantly below market. Ethan paid $1,700 a month and believed he had negotiated a great deal. The market rate was close to $3,200. Someone had been covering the difference for 5 years, and it wasn't him. Gwen's staging clients, the 3 I had referred to her quietly in year 2 of her business, were still her most reliable accounts. They made up roughly 60% of her annual revenue. She had no idea where they had originally come from. Ethan's position at the firm, senior associate, which he was quite proud of, had benefited from a recommendation I had provided to the managing partner, an old friend named Greg. When Ethan was interviewing 6 years earlier, Greg had told me at the time that Ethan was a solid candidate. Not exceptional, he said. Solid. The position had gone to Ethan partly on Greg's judgment and partly on the weight of my relationship with the firm. None of this is a crime. Parents help their children, I knew that. What I had not fully reckoned with was the size of the gap between what Ethan believed he had built and what I had actually constructed around him. I was still thinking about all of this, not yet ready to act, still hoping I had misread the dinner conversation, when the situation resolved itself into something I could not misread at all. In November, I flew to Denver for 10 days to visit my brother and his wife and to look at a small commercial property I was considering acquiring. I left my house key with Ethan, as I sometimes did, asking him to pick up the mail and check on things. I came back on a Thursday evening. The key didn't work. I stood on my own front porch, the porch I had built myself in 1998, every board cut and placed by my own hands, and my key turned in the deadbolt and caught nothing. I tried it again. Then I tried the side door. Then I called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. In the background, I could hear Gwen's voice, and then a pause. And then he said, "Oh, Dad, yeah, we meant to call you about that." They had changed the locks. Gwen, it turned out, had decided that since the house was going to be listed, she had apparently been treating this as a foregone conclusion since our dinner conversation. It made more sense for them to manage the property during the sale process. She had hired a locksmith and had the locks rekeyed. She had also, I would discover over the next 2 days, removed several pieces of furniture she considered dated, replaced them with staging pieces she owned through her business, which she planned to charge to the sale proceeds as a professional fee, and had spoken with a real estate agent about listing the property the following spring. When I asked Ethan directly whether he had authorized this, he said, and I want to get this right, because I have replayed it many times, "Dad, we're trying to help you. The house needs to be ready. You've been avoiding this." "Ethan," I said, "I have not agreed to sell my house. I know it's emotional," he said, "but you need to think practically." Then Gwen took the phone. "Harold, we're doing this because we care about you. The market is right. You'll be much happier somewhere smaller. You can't live in the past forever." I said very little after that. I told them I was going to a hotel and that we would talk soon. I hung up and sat in my car in my own driveway for a few minutes, looking at the lights on inside my house. Lights I had not turned on, in rooms Gwen had apparently redecorated. Then I called my attorney. Philip Chin had handled my legal affairs for 22 years. He had written the original incorporation documents for my company, managed every major acquisition, and sat across from me at the table when we structured Loretta's estate. He is a meticulous, patient man who speaks slowly and means everything he says. Phil, I said, I need you to begin executing the restructuring documents we discussed in August. There was a brief pause. In August, Phil and I had put together a set of contingency documents. Protective measures I had drafted after the dinner conversation made me uneasy, not because I thought I would need them, but because 40 years in business had taught me that you prepare before you need to, not after. All of them? Phil asked. All of them. I checked into a Marriott, ordered room service, and slept better than I had in months. The restructuring was not complicated, but it was thorough. First, Ethan's apartment. The arrangement between my development company and the building's management had been a gentleman's agreement that existed entirely because I had asked for it. One phone call to the property manager, a professional courtesy I was formally withdrawing, and the unit reverted to standard lease terms. Ethan would receive notice that his month-to-month arrangement was being converted to a market-rate lease, $3,100 a month, or he could vacate within 60 days. Second, Gwen's clients. The 3 referrals I had made were long-standing relationships. I reached out to each of them personally, not to say anything negative about Gwen, but simply to mention that I was pulling back from informal referral activity as part of restructuring my professional involvement. Within a few weeks, naturally, the clients' project calendars began to shift. 2 of the 3 did not renew their staging agreements. Gwen's revenue picture changed significantly. Third, Greg at the firm. I had a long and honest conversation with him. I did not ask Greg to do anything improper. I told him that I was stepping back from personal advocacy on Ethan's behalf, and that any future evaluations of Ethan's performance should be made on strictly professional merit. Greg, who is a fair man, said he appreciated the transparency. He also said quietly that the past 2 annual reviews had already been giving him pause. He had been generous with Ethan partly because of our friendship. Without that weight behind him, Ethan's trajectory at the firm would be reevaluated honestly. Fourth, and this was the part that required the most preparation, the house. Phil confirmed what I already knew. The property was mine, titled solely in my name, and no action Gwen had taken had any legal standing. The staging furniture she had moved in was trespassing on my property. The real estate agent she had spoken with had no authorization to list anything. Within 48 hours, a formal letter went to Gwen's contact at the agency, and a second letter went to Ethan and Gwen directly, informing them that any further unauthorized entry into the property would be treated as criminal trespass and that the locks had been changed back by a licensed locksmith. I drove back to Bexley on a Saturday morning. The rose bushes along the back fence were dormant for winter, just bare canes. But they were still there. I walked through the rooms Gwen had staged and felt something cold and deliberate settle over me. She had replaced Loretta's reading chair with a modern accent piece. The family photos from the hallway had been boxed and placed in the garage. I put everything back myself. The first call I got was from Gwen. She was not sympathetic. She was furious in that controlled architectural way she had, as if even her anger had been professionally designed. She said I was being stubborn. She said I was acting out of grief. She said I was making things very difficult for Ethan, who only wanted what was best for me. She said, and this landed with some weight, that I was going to die in that house alone if I wasn't careful. Gwen, I said, I want you to understand something. The locks on my house will remain as I set them. You will not enter this property without my invitation. And I would like you to take some time over the next few weeks to review your apartment lease, your client accounts, and your husband's situation at work, because some things are changing. She laughed. Is that a threat, Harold? It's information, I said. You can decide what to do with it, Ethan called that evening. He sounded genuinely shaken, which I found both painful and clarifying. My son was not a cruel person, I think. He was a poorly calibrated one. He had been handed a life and told it was a life he had earned, and he had believed it thoroughly enough to stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as an obstacle between his present situation and an upgrade. Dad, I don't understand what's happening. My leasing office sent some notice about our rent changing, and I got a message from Greg at the firm that he wants to meet Monday morning, and Gwen's client just canceled their spring project. What's going on? Ethan, I said, I want to ask you something. Do you know where your apartment came from? A pause. What do you mean? I found it on the listing sites. You found it available because I had an arrangement with the ownership group. You paid $1,700 a month for a unit that rents for over $3,000 because someone made up the difference. Silence. The client Gwen considers her core business. You know where they came from? More silence. And Greg, when you were interviewing, who do you think put the call in for you? I heard him sit down. The particular sound of someone lowering themselves into a chair slowly. I didn't know any of that, he said finally. I know you didn't. That's the problem, son. You were allowed to believe that your life was something you'd built, and it wasn't. And when you thought I was just an old man sitting on a house you wanted, you stopped treating me like someone who mattered. Dad, you stood in your kitchen, Ethan, and told me that I needed to think practically about my own home. You let your wife change my locks. You told me I was avoiding reality when the reality is that without arrangements I made for you, quietly, over years, you wouldn't have that apartment, those clients, or that job title. He didn't have a response to that. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I'm not trying to destroy you, I said, but I am not going to be managed by my own son. I need you to understand that. What do I do? He asked, and his voice sounded young in a way I had not heard in a long time. That's a good question, I said. I'd start with Monday morning. The meeting with Greg did not go well for Ethan in the short term. Greg, true to his word, had already begun an honest reassessment of Ethan's book of business. Without the accounts that traced back to my network, Ethan's contribution to the firm was thinner than his titles suggested. He was not fired. Greg was not that kind of man, but he was moved to a position more accurately reflecting his demonstrated performance, with a corresponding reduction in compensation. The apartment situation was more immediate. The market rate notice arrived by certified mail. Ethan and Gwen sat down and looked at what they actually earned versus what they actually spent, possibly for the first time, and the picture was not comfortable. They could not afford the unit at full market rate. They spent the better part of 2 months looking for alternatives and landed, eventually, in a 2-bedroom rental in Grandview, a perfectly fine neighborhood, not glamorous, a significant step down from the short north address they had come to think of as simply where they lived. Gwen's business contracted sharply. Without the 3 referral accounts, she was rebuilding from a smaller base. She picked up some work through online platforms. She was talented. I had always believed that, even through everything. And talented people find their way, but she had to actually find it. For the first time, Marcus and the real estate agent sent a formal apology through Phil's office. They had not known the agent's letter said that the property was not authorized for listing. I did not pursue anything further. I had made my point, and making it more expensive for them would not have taught Ethan anything. About 6 weeks after the locks incident, I was having coffee on my front porch on a Sunday morning when a car I didn't recognize pulled up. Ethan got out alone. He didn't ring the bell. He just stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment, looking at the rose canes along the fence. I said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning," back. Then he sat on the step below my chair, which is what he used to do when he was a boy and wanted to talk about something. He would never sit beside me, always slightly below, like he was working something out. "I call the financial advisor," he said, "an independent one. First time I've ever paid for advice on my own money rather than just asking you." I nodded. "She told me things I should have known for years." He paused. "I didn't realize how much I didn't know about my own finances until someone laid it out without cleaning it up for me." "It's a strange feeling," I said. "Yeah." He looked at his hands. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting. Because if I stop, I don't think I can start again." I said, "Go ahead." I knew, somewhere, that things had been easier for me than they should have been. I didn't ask questions about the apartment because I liked the answer I had. I didn't look too closely at how Gwen's business grew because it was growing and that was good. I let Gwen take the lead on the house stuff because I agreed with her, and it was easier than disagreeing, and because if I'm honest, I thought he stopped. I thought you'd go along with it. I thought you were soft enough to be pushed. He said that quietly, and it was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. I knew you were lonely without Mom. I thought that made you manageable. That word sat between us for a moment. I was wrong about what you were, he said, and I was wrong about what I had. And I'm sorry, Dad. Not because things changed. I'm sorry because of what I was willing to do to someone who'd given me everything. I looked out at the yard. The November light was thin and flat, and the rose canes cast long shadows across the grass. Ethan, I said, your mother would have told you this more gracefully than I'm going to, so bear with me. You are not a bad person, but you were becoming a person who did bad things without noticing, which is sometimes worse because at least a bad person knows what they're doing. He didn't say anything. I'm not going to give you back what changed, I said. The apartment, the accounts, the professional trajectory, those have to be yours, whatever they turn out to be. But I'm also not going to walk away from my son. He looked up. If you want to have a relationship, we can build one. A real one. Not me handing you things and you deciding they were yours by right. An actual relationship between two adults who know who they are. He nodded for a while without speaking. Then he said, Gwen and I have been seeing a counselor. Twice a week since November. That surprised me. It was her idea, actually. He thought about how to say it. She's harder on herself than I expected. She knows she pushed things further than she should have. She wanted me to tell you that she's sorry, not in a letter. She wanted to tell you herself, if you're willing to hear it. I thought about Gwen. I thought about Loretta's reading chair and the boxed photos in the garage. And then I thought about a woman who was, whatever else she was, talented and frightened, and perhaps now, for the first time, genuinely reckoning with something. Tell her she can call me, I said. We'll start there. Ethan stayed for about 2 hours that morning. We had coffee, and then I made eggs. And he sat at the kitchen table the way he used to after school, slightly sideways, 1 foot up on the chair. We talked about things we hadn't talked about in years. His memories of Loretta, a project I was working on in Cleveland that I actually wanted his perspective on because whatever else he was not unintelligent about finance. The conversation was careful at the edges, but it was real in the middle, which was more than we'd had in a long time. He left before noon. At the door, he turned and said, Dad, the reading chair, the one Gwen moved. It's back, I said. Same spot. He nodded and didn't say anything else. I watched him walk to his car, a different car than the lease he'd had to return, something older and sensible. He drove off without looking back. I went inside and sat in Loretta's reading chair for a while. I thought about the 41 years I had spent building something from nothing. The secondhand truck, the contractor's license, the years of 18-hour days and missed dinners and gambles that paid off and ones that didn't. I thought about the morning Loretta told me she was sick, and the 8 weeks after that, and the 4 years since of trying to understand what a life was for when the person you built it with was gone. I thought about what it meant to hand your children a world they never had to build and whether that was love or something else. Here is what I know now. The most valuable thing I could give Ethan was never the apartment subsidy or the professional connections or the financial safety net. It was what I didn't give him, the chance to fail, to figure it out, to learn that the world is negotiable and that he was capable of negotiating it. I protected him from that for 34 years, and that protection cost both of us something we didn't fully understand until it was gone. Gwen called me the following Tuesday. The conversation was not easy. She talked for a long time, and I mostly listened. She is not a villain in this story, not really. She is someone who saw the scaffolding I had built around my son's life and walked onto it without understanding. It wasn't a floor. When it shifted, she was as unprepared as he was. She asked if she could come to the house sometime, not to assess it, just to visit. I said yes. The rose bushes came back in the spring, the way they always do. I hadn't done anything to them. Loretta planted them to be resilient, and they are. Some mornings I have coffee on the porch and watch the light come across the yard, and I think about the people we raise and how they surprise us, and how the surprises are not always small or gentle, but how even the hard ones, if you wait long enough, sometimes turn into something worth having. My son is finding out who he is, so is his wife. It is slow and it is real, and it is nothing I can speed up or hand to them. It has to be earned, and I'll be here when they figure it out. Comment the city you're watching from. I always read everyone. I've thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me what this whole thing was really about. Not the locks, not the apartment, not the clients or the job title. What it was actually about. I think it was about a question I avoided for 30 years. What does it cost a person to never have to pay for anything? I gave Ethan a good life. I meant every bit of it. When Loretta was alive, we used to talk about wanting him to have the things we didn't have growing up. The safety, the footing, the sense that the ground wasn't going to shift under him without warning. We grew up knowing the ground could shift. We didn't want that for him. And so we built him a floor so solid he never once felt the earth move. The problem with that, I've come to understand, is that a person who has never felt the ground shift doesn't learn how to steady themselves. They just assume the floor is permanent. They start treating it like a right. And then, when someone they love is standing between them and something they want, they start treating that person as an obstacle instead of as the reason the floor existed in the first place. That's what happened with Ethan. And here's the part I have to own. He didn't become that way on his own. I built the conditions for it. Every time I solved the problem quietly, every time I smoothed a path without telling him the path had been smoothed, I was teaching him without meaning to. That ease was the natural state of things. That comfort arrived rather than being earned. What I did when I called Philip that night in a hotel parking lot wasn't revenge. Not really. It was the removal of something artificial. I stopped holding up a set of walls that had never been his to stand behind. And what happened next? The hard months, the financial recalibration, the counseling, the Sunday morning when Ethan sat on my porch step like he was 12 years old again. All of that was just reality. Arriving, delayed, but intact. I think about Gwen sometimes, and I try to be fair. She is a driven, capable woman who walked into a life and assumed the structure was load-bearing when most of it was propped up by a man she had decided was just a sentimental old obstacle. She wasn't entirely wrong about who I appeared to be. I had made myself appear smaller than I was because I thought that was what love looked like. Stepping back, making room, not crowding my son's sense of his own accomplishment. What I know now is that real love sometimes looks like refusal. It looks like letting someone sit with the weight of their own choices long enough to understand where the weight comes from. Ethan had to lose the apartment, the professional cushion, the comfortable illusion of a self-made life before he could begin actually making one. That's not a punishment. That's just what growing up costs when it comes late. He's doing the work now, so is Gwen. It's slow, and it's genuine, and I'm not rushing it. The rose bushes Loretta planted came back this spring without anyone helping them along, and I take some quiet meaning in that. Things that are built right tend to return, even after hard winters, even after long neglect. What I want you to take from Harold and Ethan's story, if you take anything, is this. The most loving thing you can do for someone is not always the thing that feels like love in the moment. Sometimes it is the hardest conversation. Sometimes it is the firm boundary. Sometimes it is standing still while someone you raised has to find their own way back to you. That kind of love requires something most people call character. I just call it knowing what actually matters and being willing to hold on to it even when it's uncomfortable to do so. I'm still learning that myself. At 63, I'm still learning.